We thank them for the role that they have played, but I think that their stay is not necessary for maintaining security and control. Nouri al-Maliki, Iraqi Prime Minister.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. We are having a flashback about Britain's involvement in Iraq with John Wilkes, George Joffrey and Mustafa al-Hiti. George Joffrey, what possessed British Prime Minister Tony Blair to go shoulder to shoulder with President Bush? I'm here reminded of that memo that was leaked. It was sent by, I think it was 10 Downing Street, to British ambassador to the US, to Sir Myers, if I'm not mistaken, to stay very close to President Bush, to stay very close to his bottom side, not to lose that special relationship. Was it in preservation of that special relationship that Britain went to war, or were they hoping to get something out of this rich country?
No, I think the truth is that it was basically about preserving a special relationship. It was also a question of personal conviction too. Mr. Blair certainly believed in the idea of intervention. His Chicago speech in 1999 made that very clear, and there had been previous British interventions in Sierra Leone, for example, and of course there was a NATO intervention in Kosovo as well. So he was convinced, on the one hand, of the need to support the United States at all costs, and on the other hand, of the justification for states to intervene in the affairs of other states if they believe they were behaving badly.
Which one was the stronger of the two reasons?
I think probably it was the question of supporting the American action inside Iraq. And that seemed to me, and I remember meeting Mr. Blair and discussing the matter with him, to be the overriding concern. Now, that did not reflect the views of the British military. Many of them were very unhappy about the intervention. They couldn't really see the purpose of it, but they knew that they would carry through the orders given to them by the political leadership. And that, of course, characterized the way in which British forces went in. There's another point to bear in mind there, that although there were 14,000 troops who went in, they didn't stay very long, and the numbers very rapidly declined. And I think it has to be said that for a very long period of time, the number of troops operating inside Basra was far too small to cope with the problems of the city, particularly with the militias there.
John Wilkes, you know very well how politics is played out. You are not a novice. Most probably the Americans in the long run, they are going to get their money's worth in the forms of bases, a special relationship, oil, and many other political privileges. That's for the US. What will Britain get out of it?
Well, there's no doubt that among the reasons for establishing a wide-ranging relationship with Iraq, and that's what Britain intends to do in the new stage of its relationship, we want to develop very strong trade and investment relationships, and particularly educational relationships. Traditionally, the higher education sector in Iraq has had strong links with British universities, and we want to reactivate those links. So definitely we're going to develop those relationships. But going back to the question of, you know, the background to the war and the background to the decision making, as Tony Blair himself has said, you've got to set it into the context of policy on Iraq in the 90s and the policy of sanctions that was causing immense damage to Iraq. And as George says, also the policy of interventionism in the 90s, Kosovo, Afghanistan, but even the experience for most European politicians of going through the crisis in Bosnia and delaying intervention there. All of that needs to be seen in the background of that decision.
Mustafa al-Hiti, John Wilkes just mentioned about the educational system. I had a chance to meet with you once, and you told me that at one stage in Iraq you had 103 PhDs as well as postdoctorate in the pharmacy sector alone, and nowadays you have only about 6 or 7. Most of them they fled. Can Britain come back and help and rebuild the educational system as they did in the 20s, 30s and 40s?
Well, Jassim, let me return back to the first question which we asked really regarding with the intervention. Really, it was really very bad and the worst decision taken by Bush administration and Blair to intervene in Iraq in what we call it oppressive chains. They rather have to go, or they went to Iraq and in the past to what we call it make the enabling reform if we are talking about really reform in Iraq regarding the legal system reform or the educational or economic or political one, this really, it doesn't need to change everything in Iraq. I mean, what we call the goals of the war is ever changing. If you can just go back and remember that it was a war against terrorists, then a war against justifying the mass destruction weapon, and then they said it is regarding the democracy in Iraq. If all these goals are ever changing, it means the tools are ever changing. Again, to your equation, the educational system really, it was built by the British, especially the medical one in Iraq, which was really beautiful. I think if the British were not intervened in Iraq by such a manner, which is really non-conservative one, although the British policy usually a moderate one, then the situation will be better in order to retain back the relation in the educational system.
Well, that's all for the future, Mustafa Al-Hiti. If you don't mind, just let me ask George.
By the British is less than the American.
George Jofi, both gentlemen, British Prime Minister Blair as well as President Bush, they are still adamant they were right. None of them pretty much gave, I am sorry, we made a mistake. Both of them, they think in the long run, this enterprise in Iraq, it will justify itself. Do you see it that way as a student of history?
No, I have to say I certainly don't. It's quite true. They do believe that they can justify what they did. In fact, Dick Cheney, only a couple of days ago, said that in 20, 30 years' time, the Bush presidency will be seen to have been a very good presidency indeed. I have to say I think that's nonsense. The damage done not just to Iraq, Iraq is the most egregious case, but to many other countries too as a result of these kinds of policies has been colossal. The situation today in the Middle East is far worse than it was at the beginning of this decade. And a large part of the responsibility for that lies with the decision to invade Iraq and to do it so badly, quite apart from whether it was an appropriate thing to do or not. I have to say, Mr. Blair may well claim that he is justified in what he decided to do, but he's going to be speaking entirely alone.
John Wilkes, where do we go from here?
I think the debate over was it worth it, was it a mistake, will continue, and most people took up their positions at the time of the war and most people haven't changed. What will define that debate is the actual condition on the ground in Iraq. If Iraq is chaotic, then those who argued against the war, they will maintain a very strong argument. If Iraq stabilizes and the economy gets moving and refugees return, then I think the balance of the arguments will change. So behind Britain's commitment to moving in the new year from a military relationship to a civilian relationship is all about improving conditions on the ground in Iraq. Yes, security is key, but in Basra and much of the south, there is now a reasonable level of security, and it's sustainable. The Iraqis can continue to improve. On that, we can offer technical and educational
help. Let me pose that to Mustafa Al-Hiti. The ball is in your court. If Iraq is to relapse into dictatorship and anarchy after the liberation by the British and the Americans, you have only yourself to blame. That's what John Wilkes is saying.
Well, I don't think we return to the kind of autocratic kind of government. But let me just say, I mean, regarding the intervention in Iraq by such a method, Barack Obama said, we have been inside Iraq irresponsible for the invasion. I think the withdrawal should be responsible, and this responsibility should be really taken form in the form of reforms. The one which I suggest, the legal reform, the educational reform, the legal system, I mean, and the economic kind of reform, educational one, and these need really to put a lot of weight regarding the state and the United Kingdom in order to make this reform. Otherwise, if they are pulling out of the country just quickly and leaving the country in the chaos state, which has been in, then this is a big mistake, and then correction, what you call it, the wrong things by worse thing.
George Jofi, your last comment, both in 1917 and 2003, hold on just a second. The British, went in through Basra first, general mode, and now the British in 2002, and you have written a lot about that. If you are to compare both military campaigns and both intervention, how would you look at them?
I would say that the second repeated many of the mistakes of the first. That in short, we learnt nothing really from our early experience in Iraq. And one of the tragedies is that we were therefore able to repeat the mistakes we originally made. We should have learned from the 1920 rebellion. We didn't. We should have understood the implications of Iraqi society. We didn't. We should have understood too that the American view of Iraq was grossly wrong. And the result is that even though of course Iraqis have a responsibility for their own future, the responsibility is powerfully shared with both the United States and Britain, and any suggestion that either country can simply step away from that responsibility is simply wrong.
John Wilkes, you have 30 seconds. Go ahead.
I absolutely agree with what George has just said. We have a responsibility towards the Iraqi people and the Iraqi government, and I agree with the agenda that Dr. Mustafa set forward. It's about rule of law, capacity in the legal sector, capacity in education. That's what Britain is now moving towards. We're entering a new and exciting stage in this relationship. Iraqis don't want foreign troops in their country if their own troops can maintain security. They can do that in Basra. What they want from us are two things: technical and educational help, and then also political support, because Iraq is going to face challenges with the neighbouring countries and with others in the region. Britain is committed to offering both of those things, and we want the relationship to strengthen in years to come.
John Wilkes, George Jofi, Mustafa Al-Hiti, gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To access the show and to send us your comments, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show for this week. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, goodbye.